Tonight's discussion, a tough discussion series, and tonight we're talking about the truth about addiction. I actually should have called it the truth about substance abuse, because it's more about substance abuse than it is about addiction, right? But let's get into that when we get further down about defining what the addiction or the abuse looks like. Um, but one thing I just wanted to point out before we get started is that the tough discussions is not intended to resolve the problems or provide answers for everything as we go through the discussion now, because I'm sure you can acknowledge that even if we went for the full 1 hour or 1.5 hours like we did once before, it's not nearly enough time to do justice to some of these discussions. But what it is intended to do, if nothing else, it is intended to at least encourage a fresh perspective, because there are some long-held truths that have long since become obsolete that we continue to use to measure and guide our thinking about mental health and about human behavior. So this is my humble effort, and I know proclamation of humility is arrogance, so not to be arrogant, but this is my small effort to try to encourage a fresh approach to some of these things, because we're not doing ourselves any favors. All the trends, everything that we see happening around us indicates that our approach to mental health, our approach to addiction, to substance abuse is not where it needs to be, because we're not winning that war. We're not winning that struggle against it. So something has to change, and I'm hoping that through the tough discussion series that I've been presenting every week for the last few weeks now, I'm hoping that some of these things that we've always taken for granted, we'll now start looking at it slightly differently, and hopefully that will head us off in a new direction that might just give us the results we're looking for. As always, we start off with our friend Einstein, which is for you to keep me honest, make sure that I keep things simple. If I don't keep it simple, I don't understand it well enough. If I oversimplify it, it means that I'm undermining the significance of it. So help me to keep a balanced tone in all of that. The ground rules for growth: understanding is not justifying. So we're going to seek to understand what is happening with substance abuse, or the person who is subject to substance abuse, right? And I'm going to try to avoid using the term addict, but I'll tell you more about that just now. So we're going to try to understand, and in understanding, we're not seeking to justify or condone or defend the behavior. We're going to focus on the points being raised. We're not going to focus on the individuals and how it is that they may be affecting the people around them, because that's a very complex issue and very unique to each situation. So we'll deal with that separately if needed. You need to own your space. You need to own how you respond to this. All right, this is a very provocative, emotive topic. So especially if you are affected by it directly, or you know someone close to you that is affected by it directly, this is a very emotive space. So please own your response to it. If you feel triggered, understand why it triggers you. If you feel emotional, or if you feel undermined in any way, let's try to understand why, rather than just assuming that it's an attack against you or your experience. We're going to be very analytical about some of the points, and being analytical about emotions is not to undermine the emotions, it is to understand it. Because the more we understand it, the more we are capable of being effective in our response to it. So we don't respond to the symptom, we respond to the actual underlying influences that cause the symptoms. And we don't judge. We don't judge because judgment demands that we compare against something from our side that we believe is the right way to do something, and then we judge how someone is complying with that standard. So we don't judge, we seek to understand the underlying influence and the underlying behavior, so that we can appreciate why they behave that way. And in appreciating why they behave that way, we'll be able to deal with the triggers and the influences and the needs that drives them to behave the way they do, rather than focusing on how it is that we judge them against the standard that society sets. The human experience, I touched on this in the discussion about narcissists, because if the moment we label the human experience, we predispose ourselves and the person that's being labeled to behave within the construct or within the confines or parameters of that label, all right? And I firmly believe that the human experience is not a mental illness, it's not a mental disorder. It's the human experience. And if we understand what is driving that experience and what is driving that response to the experience, we'll realize that it's not because there is something fundamentally wrong. It is just the way in which that person who is affected by that experience is responding. And the way he responds, that is what it is that we need to understand, right? So the human experience is not a mental illness. It's not a mental disorder. It is the human experience, and seeking to understand the human experience is what will hopefully get us to a point of being able to identify what are the things that we need to influence or change to be able to encourage the behavior that we're looking for, or that we hope would be more beneficial. There will be views that will be very contentious. And that's not to be sensationalistic about it. The views that are going to be contentious is going to be views that are going to challenge what we currently assume to be the reality of drug addiction or the behavior of so-called addicts. How many of you believe that the current approach to rehab is successful? And before you answer that, I want to give you some stats, and then maybe you can think about it again and then respond. So, based on feedback from clients and from people that I know that are directly involved in some of the rehab programs and the support groups in that, the general gut feel is that, and apparently this is claimed by some of the facilitators of the rehab, of the support groups, is that the general recovery rate of addicts is 1%. 1%. That's local. So I went and I looked further afield. And I wanted to see if this was a shared experience. And it gets slightly more optimistic, but listen to this. From a website called drugabuse.gov, which is an American website, they claim that their recovery rate, their recovery rate is 30%. But get this, 30% is measured only for those people who completed their program. So if you drop out of the program, that is a relapse, but it's not counted as a relapse, so it doesn't affect their stats. So the stats already is now starting to be inflated because we need to appear to be more successful than we really are so that we can provide hope in the programs, right? And this is all a very similar approach to rehab, and I'll talk about the approach to rehab in a minute. Another website I got to was the recoveryvillage.com. And according to them, their best rate of recovery they could come up with was 21%. Now think about this. Firstly, we know that not all people who are involved in substance abuse get to rehab centers. Secondly, the ones that get there, we know that they very often don't follow through on the full program. And thirdly, we know that it's in the interests of the rehab facilities to make sure that the recovery rates look as optimistic as possible. Now, despite all of that, we've got number as high as 30% being the highest recovery rate that they can talk about, and we know that is also a adopted number as well. So already, as a start, we can see that the current approach to rehab, and this is a very cursory approach, I understand, but the current approach to rehab and the way we can see it now in the experience for people that are actually affected by it, it's not effective. If anyone says that 20% recovery rate or even 30% as an optimistic value is acceptable, then we're sadly mistaken. The current rehab approach almost every single time appears to be based on what they call 12-point plan or 12-point program. And the 12-point program, I'm not going to go into the detail of the 12 points, but the 12-point program is focused on framing the substance abuser or the addict in a way so that they can understand that this is something that's bigger than them and they need to reach out for help to overcome it. So as an underlying theme, as a consistent theme across the board, the current approach to rehab positions the addict as a victim of addiction. And if anyone disagrees, please challenge me. But this is consistent across the board. So the current approach to rehab, think about this. This is massive. Positions the addict as a victim of addiction. And some go as far as saying that addiction is a disease. I'm not going to get into that debate. I disagree with it, but I'm not going to get into that debate tonight because it's a big debate on its own. And as part of the recovery process, when you emerge from the rehab program, there's something that they call the 4Ps. And this is just to re-emphasize exactly what the rehab process currently does to the mindset of the addict. The 4Ps, some of you may be familiar with, is called people, places, playgrounds, and playthings. People, places, playgrounds, and playthings. Now, these 4Ps is what is given to the recovering addict to let them know that in order to stay clean or to minimize your opportunity for relapse, you need to avoid those 4 things. Avoid people that remind you about your substance abuse habit or the trigger it. Avoid places where you know you will be more inclined and it will be more accessible. Playgrounds are the places where you go and hang out and you have recreation facilities. And if that recreational environment also gives you access to the substances that you would abuse, avoid that. And playthings, all right? Playthings is sometimes also referred to as the actual substance itself, the drugs itself that people use to escape these things. So, the rehab approach, for all intents and purposes, right now, takes the addict and turns them into a victim of what it is that they're doing and convinces them that the only way you're going to emerge from that space is if you recognize that you are powerless against it and that you need this entire support structure around you and this avoidance strategy to make sure that you don't succumb to it again. That's what the current one does, all right? That's the current rehab approach. There might be exceptions, but by and large, across the board, that is what they teach people that they consider to be addicts. So there was another thing that came up in my research about this, which was very, very interesting. And that is that there is a very strong correlation in the experience and the response to lifestyle diseases compared to addiction. Just bear with me here. It sounds like a stretch, but just listen to this. Now, lifestyle diseases are also known as chronic illnesses. And the reason that they often refer to chronic illnesses as lifestyle diseases is because usually the most effective way to respond to a chronic illness is to make lifestyle changes. And those lifestyle changes usually focus on how you deal with stress, eating habits, your activity levels, everything related to a wholesome lifestyle, right? So in what I found, there's a very strong correlation between addiction and how that is experienced, how it plays out, and lifestyle diseases. One of the things is that they're both based on choice. They both relate to choices that people make and then succumb to this illness or this disease that we believe is afflicting them. Because like I said just now, there's a lot of people that assume that addiction is actually a disease. All right? I'll come back to that just now. Another thing that we need to consider is that the response to lifestyle diseases or chronic illnesses and the response to addiction is almost identical. Both of them are focused on coping with the illness rather than overcoming it. Now, I'm talking of the mainstream approaches, not the alternate health approaches. So both of them are focused on coping with the illness, which again reinforces the mentality that says you are a victim of something. So you need to cope with it as best as you can because overcoming it is impossible. So the other thing that was also consistent in what I discovered between addiction and lifestyle diseases is that they both are recognized as being affected or influenced by underlying emotional trauma or stress as being the key influences that are consistent between both. So in both cases, the stress or the underlying or trauma or traumatic experience is what gives rise to the lifestyle disease and gives rise to addictive kind of behavior. All right. And the reason why this is important, why is because if we can recognize in the chronic illnesses that it's a lifestyle choice that needs to be made, why is it that we dismiss that when it comes to addiction? Why don't we recognize that it's also lifestyle choices that lead them into that space as well? Labeling an addict, and this is the reason why I don't like to label someone as an addict, because the moment you label someone as an addict, the first thing that happens, and this is critically important, the first thing that happens when you label someone as an addict is you dehumanize them. And the reason you dehumanize them is because you take the entire human experience that leads them up to that point of needing to escape from their reality. You take that entire human experience and you diminish it, and you now only focus on the fact that you are not all of that you've experienced. You are just the symptom that we're now seeing, and you are therefore an addict, and you need to acknowledge that you're an addict, and this is going to be a lifetime thing. Because the other thing that they always tell you in rehab is that you are always going to be a recovering addict or a recovering alcoholic, right? You guys must be familiar with this. It's always in the movies when they talk about alcoholism and things like that. That you're a recovering alcoholic for the rest of your life. You're a recovering addict for the rest of your life. It's absolute rubbish. And hopefully we'll touch on that in a little while. So the moment you label someone as being an addict or an alcoholic or anything like that, you are labeling the behavior and you are dehumanizing the person behind the behavior. And then immediately your attention is drawn to the symptom, to the behavior, and instead of dealing with the underlying experience that's driving that behavior, or driving that insecurity or whatever it is that's getting them to that point, you ignore that and you focus on the fact that no, you are this label. Substance abuse is a means to escape. And that's critical, all right? Because we're so focused on the fact that, okay, you want to escape, you take these drugs that allow you to hallucinate into another world, it allow you to escape reality, whatever it is. But we don't stop long enough to understand why it is that they feel the need to escape in the first place. If we go to the judgment route, we look at them and say, you're trying to escape because you're weak. You can't face reality. You don't want to own your shit. But that assumes that they have the same emotional capacity, capability, skill, tool set, breadth of experience that we have. You know, us that's judging them, we assume that they have that same experience as we have, which is why we expect them to respond to life the same way we respond to life. We assume they've got the same access to support and resources and wholesomeness of environment as we have. So that's why we find it easy to judge someone who threw their life away supposedly because they made bad choices. So the most important thing there is we need to understand what are they escaping and why did they decide that escaping is the only option. Because the only time you'll try to escape something rather than face it head on is if you have no reason to believe that you are capable of overcoming what it is that you're facing. Think about that. There would be no reason for me to escape my reality if I had reason to believe that I was capable of thriving despite my reality. All right? And already you're starting to see that an addict is not just an addict. That there's a lot more to this. And if we start trying to appreciate why they get into that space and what contributes to it, that then becomes the area of focus that allows us to get answers towards a strategy that will provide us with a much more sustainable outcome rather than assuming that they're only that way because they just don't want to own their shit. It does not sound strange coming from me because I'm always saying around to own their shit, right? But the thing is, at times we get to a point of weakness where we just feel so overwhelmed that owning your shit just feels too daunting. In fact, you don't even know how to, or you don't even realize that you're not doing it. So at that point, those that are not directly affected or that are not overwhelmed by that experience, it then becomes their responsibility to uplift so that we can get that person to a point where they find the tools and the capability and the resources to be able to own what they need to own so that they can emerge from that space. Every single time that I've had any discussion with anyone affected by someone who is an addict, right? And I'm saying addict in inverted commas. Every single time I encountered someone that was affected by this, all the focus has been only on the person who is carrying out the substance abuse. And it makes sense, right? We automatically assume that if that's the person behaving badly, we need to focus on their behavior and trying to correct their behavior. Yes, ideally we should be able to. But is that where the answers lie? Because remember, they're trying to escape something. They're trying to escape something that they believe they cannot overcome. So if they're trying to escape something that they believe they cannot overcome, should we be looking at their behavior, or should we be looking at why it is that they believe they cannot overcome what they're facing? Which brings us to the real elephant in the room. And the real elephant in the room is that as weak or as selfish or as whatever it is that we want to judge them for, the behavior of the substance abuser might seem, they only want to escape that reality because there's elements, or there are elements about that reality that they feel powerless against. And that's two things. The one is the environment, and the second one is the support structure. And that support structure includes emotional support more than anything else. You see, the person that succumbs to substance abuse is someone that has slowly lost their sense of self, their sense of dignity, their sense of significance. And because they've lost that sense of significance, they find unhealthy ways in which to try and demand that significance, demand that attention, demand that focus. Now again, we're not condoning or justifying their choices, because that's not what we're here to do. We're trying to understand why it is that they choose the destructive path, because we, from our vantage point, can see so many other options for them, right? And often we look at what is that they have access to materially around them, options, opportunities, comforts, luxuries, resources. We look at all of that and we think, well, you've got nothing to complain about. But the problem is, it's never ever our material wealth or our tangible resources that we have access to that defines our sense of self. Our sense of self, our sense of significance is always defined by how we believe we are perceived by the significant ones around us. And we never ever look at the substance abuser, the addict. We never look at them and think, well, why is it that you feel like you're less than human, that you're insignificant? We're always looking at them and thinking, well, why are you being so selfish and undermining the significance of the people around you? And again, we lose sight of what is the influence that drives their behavior, and we focus on the symptoms, and we try to address the symptoms, and we take the symptoms and we throw it back at them and tell them that you need to own this. And that is one of the biggest reasons why we're not making progress with rehab. Because we're so focused on blaming the person that made the bad choice that we don't stop to consider what are all the influences around them that gives them little reason to have hope of being significant in the environment or in the structure, the social structure that they might be part of. So what needs to change? And this is now addressed to the person that is struggling with substance abuse. And hopefully, in hearing this perspective, it will also encourage the people affected by their behavior to think differently about it. The first thing we need to do is you need to recognize the humanness of your experience. There is a humanness behind what drives us emotionally, that if we lose sight of that, we dismiss that human component and we start judging. It only becomes possible to judge when you assume that someone is deliberate in the way they're behaving. And at times, on rare occasions when they are deliberate, even then it's usually because they're seeking to find significance in a way that is unhealthy, because they've given up hope, or they just don't know how to gain that same significance through a healthy, more constructive approach to dealing with that. So the first thing you have to do is you have to recognize the humanness behind the experience. Before we start attaching labels and everything else to them about their behavior and their mental state and everything else, recognize the human experience. Connect with their pain. Establish some empathy for the condition they find themselves in. And then from there you start trying to unravel why it is that they're in that space and why it is that they believe that that's the only option for them. Coping mechanisms will fail you. I cannot emphasize this enough. I think I've touched on it in every single one of my discussions to date, and I will keep repeating this. Coping mechanisms will fail. And when they fail you, they will leave you in a worse state than you were before you adopted that coping mechanism. And in this case, as I pointed out earlier, the entire approach to rehab is a coping mechanism. It's how to avoid. It's always fear-based. It's always run away from what it is that you're trying to overcome. It's never about overcoming it and thriving and making sure that it has no power over you any longer. It's always about the fact that this will always have that influence over you, and you need to make sure that you keep yourself away from that influence in that environment if you hope to not succumb to it again. That's not helpful at all. All you're doing is you're disempowering the person that we actually need to be empowering. Coping mechanisms will fail you. You cannot focus on coping mechanisms as a long-term solution. You can look at it as an interim solution only. And while it is being used as an interim solution, you need to understand what is driving the behavior that underlies that condition, and then deal with that so that they can continue without any need for the coping mechanism. And talking about the coping mechanism, here's an example I like to use when I describe the difference between the victim mindset to where it is that we actually need to be when we talk about addiction or substance abuse. Imagine that you broke your leg, and that broken leg is the reality that you don't want to face, right? And in order to deal with that broken leg, with that reality, you need a crutch. And that crutch you use is the substance abuse. It's this escape. And substance abuse, it might be drugs or it might be alcohol in some cases, but we all have our guilty pleasures. For some it's gambling, for others it's anything that is your go-to to escape reality that gets to a point of being destructive or disruptive in your life, negatively disruptive. Consider that to be an addiction. So that's your broken leg. Your reality is your broken leg. And in order to deal with that reality, you need a crutch. So you get the crutch and you are now able to walk with a broken leg, because that's how you cope, right? You're using the crutch to cope with the broken leg. Now here's the thing. When your leg heals, if something about your reality changes, do you want to break your leg again so that you can hold on to that crutch? Or do you have the courage to let go of the crutch and actually start using your leg again? And that's the dilemma that is faced by someone that gives into substance abuse. Is they need to convince themselves that that reality, that broken leg, doesn't serve them as well as the crutch. So in dealing with that, in allowing to heal, in finding a way to heal the broken leg, they will have to get rid of the crutch. But if they don't have any confidence, any reason to believe that they will be capable or successful in being able to heal their broken leg, in being able to remedy that reality that they're trying to escape, and they believe that they cannot live without it either, and that's the other critical part, right? It's where you get caught between, I don't want this but I can't let go of it, or I don't want this but there's no way I can extract myself from it. And when you're in that space, that's when the escapism becomes a requirement. So that escapism, that is because you have no hope of overcoming the reality that you are avoiding. So substance abuse, anything that gets you to detach from that reality, that becomes your go-to. So do you break your leg again to hold on to the crutch, or do you get rid of the crutch and face the courage of allowing your leg to heal correctly and move forward? You need to recalibrate your expectations from the people around you. See, more often than not, in fact I would go as far as saying that 99.9% of the time, people succumb to addiction, to substance abuse, because they believe that no matter what their best efforts are, they will always be insignificant to their significant others. And those significant others, sadly, is family. And if the rest of the family operates relatively well within that current family culture, they won't recognize that there's one amongst them that might need more. And because of that, because that emotional accessibility is constrained, is inaccessible, because that family environment might be emotionally inaccessible, they won't recognize that need for emotional support as being a valid human need. Instead, they'll see it as a weakness. Because you cannot give what you don't have. You cannot provide emotional support to someone if you yourself haven't experienced it. And when we talk about genetic inheritance of things like addiction and that, every single time that someone came to me with something like that is a belief that is why they couldn't break certain habits. We confirm that the reason we see this supposed inheritance is because the environment in which they are raised and in which they live sustains that response to life. It's like a family culture that establishes that as being the response to life, and that gives rise to different behavioral patterns. And when we see the consistency of the behavioral patterns, we don't recognize the consistency of the environment that nurtures that pattern. We instead assume that it must be genetics. We're seriously distracted in how we look at this issue. The human experience is not a mental illness. It's not a mental disorder. The human experience is the human experience, and we've grown so detached from that human experience that we find it easy to judge the outcome of that experience by someone that is behaving less than what we would want them to behave, rather than trying to actually connect with them at an emotional level to understand why it is that they feel insignificant in a space that is critically important to them. And the more you find yourself incapable of being able to respond emotionally or connect emotionally, it's either because you haven't had that experience yourself, you haven't had that breadth of emotional connection yourself, or you feel threatened by it. What if you try to get the addict help? The one difficulty that is in all of this, which is the same with chronic illnesses for that matter, and so-called mental disorders, is that you cannot help someone that doesn't want to be helped. But more often than not, it's about who is trying to offer that help. You see? Because, let me put it this way, purely as an example, right? If I am trying to escape a reality that makes me feel less than human or insignificant in some way, and the reason that reality is like that is because, let's say I've got a poor relationship with a parent or a significant other in my family. Unless that significant other is going to recognize my significance, I might be so fixated on only looking for help or acceptance from that source that I'll decline any other, or I'll reject any other assistance that might come my way. So we need to recognize that the ultimate choice is still with the person that is trying to escape. All right? And our challenge there is to get them to realize that this way in which they're trying to achieve significance, that sense of self, it's only harming them, and it's only wasting their life away and preventing them from offering to the world what it is that they know the world needs. Relative to their reality, they know what the world needs to be better than what it is that, compared to how they're experiencing it. It's a difficult one to be able to prompt someone else to go into rehab or to go into some or other coaching program or anything like that if they themselves are not committed to it. But it doesn't hurt to at least expose them to it so that they understand, and you plant seeds that there is an alternative. There is something that you can do alternate to what it is that you're doing to escape this reality or to deal with this reality that you're trying to avoid. So that at some point they might realize that, listen, it's not worth it for me to throw my life away just because someone else is treating me badly. I should rather just accept that they are who they are, and I need to move on with my life so that I can actually make something better than this out of what it is that I've got left in this world, what time I've got left. If there's anyone that needs assistance with substance abuse, or family members or significant others that are suffering from substance abuse, please inbox me or contact me via my website, zaidismail.com. And if you want to even support the existing rehab process that you might be supporting them through, it's a starting point, it's a coping mechanism. And like I said, coping mechanisms are interim. It's not something that is sustainable long term, which is why you have so many relapses later on, because it's it doesn't resolve the root cause of why people feel the need to escape. And if you're not going to resolve the root cause, you're going to consistently get back to dealing with the symptoms, which is why the coping mechanisms fail. So if you have someone that's in a space where the coping mechanism is effective for now, it's a good time to get them into an alternate approach that resolves the underlying causes, so that you know that you don't have to run the risk of the coping mechanism failing and them relapsing. And unless there's any other questions, any comments, I'm going to end off on that note. Thank you for joining me. I hope that was valuable, and I hope it starts off new discussions both in your own spaces and with me in the group. And let's see if we can just get some momentum and some critical mass behind changing the way it is that we perceive and interact with people that have fallen to substance abuse. Take care. I hope that was value to you. Assalamu alaikum.